Never before in the 389-year history of Harvard University had an event, seemingly an ordinary academic lecture, become a fateful moment that ended the illustrious career of a professor and opened a new chapter in human history. When Professor Thaddeus Sterling arrogantly declared Africa has contributed nothing to human civilization, he could not have anticipated that his challenge would be met by Ibrahim Traore, president of Burkina Faso. In just 10 minutes, Traoré's sharp, resolute words not only exposed ignorance and prejudice, but also rewrote forgotten pages of history, forever changing the perception of a great continent. Before diving into the story, comment where you're watching from and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the latest stories. In the mild March air, the atmosphere at Sanders Theatre, the symbol of knowledge and dignity, was thick with anticipation. This was the annual lecture on global leadership in the 21st century, attracting academic and political elites from around the world. On the podium, Professor Thaddeus Sterling stood like a monument. Silver-haired, wearing metal-framed glasses, his every word exuded erudition, yet concealed a deep-seated bias about the superiority of the West. He was the gatekeeper of accepted knowledge, and his lecture, it seemed, would follow a predictable path. In the front row, a figure drew little attention: Ibrahim Traore. The young president of Burkina Faso sat there in a simple dark suit, diligently taking notes. His eyes were contemplative, calm, yet harbored a resolute fire. He had come to Harvard with a mindset of learning, with no intention of confrontation, but history chose him to break the silence. Professor Sterling, after hollow praises of Western civilization, suddenly shifted tone. A smirk appeared as he uttered a provocative challenge that ignited everything. "I challenge anyone in this room to name a single significant contribution of sub-Saharan Africa to human civilization." The silence following Sterling's declaration was not one of agreement, but a heavy curtain of shock, indignation, and paralysis. In the historic lecture hall, his arrogant words echoed, freezing hundreds of scholars, students, and guests, especially those of African descent. From young students to veteran professors, felt deeply insulted, their national pride struck head-on. Ibrahim Traore, in his simple dark suit, closed his notebook. His hand gently placed the pen on the table, each movement deliberate and slow, as if organizing a torrent of thoughts. His face remained calm, showing no trace of anger or shock, but deep within his eyes, a fire had begun to blaze. Slowly he raised his hand, his arm lifted steadily, without hesitation. Professor Sterling, preparing to move to the next topic, frowned in annoyance. He hadn't expected anyone to challenge him. His eyes flicked toward Traore, visibly irritated, but maintaining his haughty demeanor. "Yes, perhaps someone has a question, though this isn't the Q&A session." His tone dripped with sarcasm, as if reluctantly granting a favor. Traore stood up. The entire audience held its breath, watching. Without his mop, "Waddle fornum de morta mirgrapes to p and menu mergenate." He didn't rush to the microphone, but stood in place, back straight, exuding confidence and dignity. His voice resonated through the hall, clear and powerful. "Professor Sterling," he began, his tone calm but weighty, "may I respond to your statement if I may?" Sterling's smirk widened. "Oh, by all means, sir." He paused, pretending to forget Traore's name, though the president had been formally introduced at the start of the event. It was a deliberate slight, meant to diminish his opponent's stature and credibility before the audience. Traore, maintaining astonishing composure, responded simply, unshaken, "Traore, Ibrahim Traore." He didn't mention his title as president, placing himself on equal footing with the professor in this intellectual debate. A buzz of excitement rippled through the room. Whispers arose. Sterling, still arrogant, gestured toward the podium as if granting a favor. "Please enlighten us, but try to stick to historical facts rather than romanticized nationalism." His condescending tone was almost tangible, like a slap in the face. Traore walked slowly, deliberately to the podium. He carried a simple leather briefcase, placing it carefully on the lectern. For a moment, he stood silently, scanning the audience, then locked eyes with Professor Sterling, a piercing, fearless gaze. "Professor," he began, before addressing Sterling's challenge, "may I ask you a question?" He paused, his gaze sharp as a dagger, cutting through the professor's smugness. "In your extensive research, have you ever visited the manuscript collections in Timbuktu? Have you studied the mathematical treatises of the Dogon people? Have you examined the metallurgical techniques of the Haya in Tanzania?" Sterling waved dismissively. "Ancient mud buildings and primitive folklore hardly constitute civilization, Mr. Traore. We're talking about contributions to human progress, not anthropological curiosities." Gasps echoed in the room at this blatant disrespect. But Traore remained remarkably calm. He slowly opened his briefcase, retrieving a single document. "If that's the case," Traore said, his voice still calm but carrying an unusual weight, "let's start with something you might recognize." He held up a photocopy of an ancient text. "This is a page from the Lubombo bone, found in Swaziland. It's 44,000 years old, Professor. It contains the earliest known mathematical calculations in human history, 29 distinct notches marking lunar cycles. Mathematics didn't begin in Greece, Professor. It began in Africa." The smirk on Sterling's face began to fade, but he quickly regained his feigned confidence. "Counting notches is hardly comparable to Pythagoras," he scoffed. Traore pulled out another document. "Then perhaps we should discuss the Ishango bone from the Democratic Republic of Congo, dated 20,000 years old, showing evidence of prime numbers, multiplication and division. That predates Greek mathematics by nearly 19,000 years." He paused, letting the numbers sink in. "But you want more recent examples? Very well." Traore didn't rush, showing no trace of gloating as Sterling's expression shifted. Sterling, once smug in his vast knowledge, now seemed to grapple with information entirely outside his map of knowledge built over decades. Traore's calm contrasted with Sterling's growing unease, creating an invisible but immense pressure in the room. The audience, initially whispering, fell silent, all eyes fixed on the young president, eager for what came next. "Let's discuss the University of Sankore in Timbuktu," Traore continued, his voice growing stronger, laced with evident pride. "In the 12th century, when Oxford was still a collection of taverns and Harvard didn't exist, Sankore was a radiant center of knowledge. It wasn't just a school, it was a vast academic complex, housing over 700,000 manuscripts on astronomy, mathematics, medicine, law and ethics. Did you know, Professor, that at its peak, Timbuktu educated 25,000 students at once? That's more than the entire population of many European cities at the time." He paused, letting the image of a glorious Timbuktu, starkly contrasting stereotypes of a savage and backward Africa, settle in the audience's minds. While Europe was mired in the Dark Ages, where knowledge was forgotten and burned, African Muslim scholars in Timbuktu, Jenne, and Gao preserved and advanced the torch of knowledge. They not only translated ancient Greek and Roman works, but added their own research, contributing to algebra, geometry, clinical medicine, and physics. Names like Ahmed Baba al-Masufi, who wrote over 40 works on Islamic law, Arabic and astronomy, or Mohammed Bagayogo, one of the most erudite Islamic scholars, trained countless lawyers, doctors and scientists. Traore didn't stop. He ensured every word was a bucket of cold water on the face of stubborn ignorance. "You speak of primitive folklore? The thousands of manuscripts from Timbuktu, a vast library built in the desert by African intellect, are the most eloquent proof that Africa was a hub of knowledge, a cradle of relentless learning. It wasn't just a place of preservation, but of knowledge creation, yet our history has been blatantly erased from your curricula." Professor Sterling's face no longer showed smugness. It had shifted to clear discomfort, tinged with anxiety. He hadn't expected this young president to counter so thoroughly and meticulously with information he likely never studied or deliberately ignored. Some senior professors exchanged glances, some nodded, others looked astonished, as if hearing these facts for the first time. "You also claim law originated in Rome," Traore continued, his voice resonant, clear and unwavering. Professor, have you ever studied the constitution of the Ashanti Confederacy? He referenced this powerful West African alliance. 3 centuries before the U.S. Constitution, the Ashanti Constitution included principles of checks and balances, dividing government into branches to prevent autocracy. It had provisions for citizens' rights, property protection, and public participation in decision-making. It was a complex, sophisticated democratic system built on local councils and elected representatives, while Europe was still ruled by absolute monarchs. Traore tilted his head slightly, emphasizing his point. Or consider the Buganda Parliament in East Africa. With its intricate democratic governance existing for centuries, they had a prime minister, ministers, and a parliament with elected representatives from across the kingdom. Debates were recorded, decisions made after carefully considering public opinion. This isn't folklore, Professor. These are real legal and political systems, effectively ensuring social order and rights for millions, at a time when law in much of Europe was still the arbitrary whim of a king. And if you want more, Traore pressed on, look into the Korokan Fuga Charter of the Mali Empire, enacted in 1236. It's one of the earliest human rights declarations in the world. It included provisions for social equality, the right to life, freedom, property protection, and even the right to education. It banned torture, prohibited the enslavement of free people, and established fair punishments. A comprehensive constitution like this emerged in Africa in the 13th century, while you focus solely on Rome and Greece, as if they were the only sources of legal thought. Ibrahim Traore's calm words were a solid wall, reflecting back every arrogant jab from Professor Sterling. The professor, once proud of his deep knowledge of Roman law and Greek philosophy, now stood like a statue stripped of its facade. Sweat beaded on his forehead, while the audience, initially tense, now buzzed with excitement and awe. They weren't just hearing a speech, they were witnessing a revolution in perception, a redefinition of human history as they'd been taught. You also claim philosophy comes from Germany? Traore continued, his voice still resonant, but now carrying a deeper questioning tone. He was touching one of the West's supposedly sturdiest pillars of civilization. Professor, have you read the philosophical texts of Zera Jacob, the 17th century Ethiopian philosopher? He paused, letting the name linger. Zera Jacob, a reclusive figure, developed groundbreaking ideas on rational thought, human rights, and personal ethics, uninfluenced by European philosophy. He believed humans could seek truth through reason alone, without dogma or external intervention. Traore raised an eyebrow, highlighting the contrast. Compare his ideas to European philosophers of the same era, still bound by theology and feudal systems. Zera Jacob laid the foundation for an African intellectual revolution, our own enlightenment, where humans were central and reason was the beacon. And his student, Walter Huat, Traore continued, was also a great thinker, writing treatises on ethics and metaphysics that I dare say rival any produced in Europe at the time. They discussed the nature of good and evil, individual responsibility to the community, and the purpose of life. These were written in Ge'ez, an ancient and richly symbolic language, but perhaps because it wasn't Latin or Greek, they weren't worthy of your curricula. Traore's tone carried a subtle bitterness, exposing the linguistic and cultural bias in Western academia. A wave of murmurs spread through the audience. Many students, especially those in philosophy and history, began scribbling eagerly. Some professors, initially skeptical, now showed clear surprise and even admiration. They seemed to be hearing of an intellectual world they'd never imagined. And if we talk about philosophy, not just through academic texts, but through concepts shaping society, Traore continued, his voice deeper, more resonant, you cannot overlook Ubuntu, a profound philosophical concept of the Bantu people in southern Africa. Ubuntu isn't just a word, it's a way of life, roughly translated as I am because we are, or a person is a person through others. It emphasizes connection, empathy, compassion, and collective responsibility. He looked directly at Professor Sterling, who was trying to avoid his gaze. While European philosophy, especially post-Enlightenment, often fixated on individual rights, personal independence, and sometimes conquest, Ubuntu focuses on community harmony, restorative justice, and the dignity of each person in relation to others. It teaches that an individual's value lies not in possessions or individual achievements, but in how they interact with and contribute to the community. Justice isn't just punishment, it's about healing relationships and restoring social balance. Isn't this what your civilized world is struggling to achieve in modern legal and social systems? Traore questioned, needing no direct answer. We talk about restorative justice as a novel concept, but it's been the foundation of Ubuntu for centuries. We discuss corporate social responsibility, but Ubuntu has long taught individual responsibility to the community. You call it primitive folklore, I call it timeless wisdom, the ethical foundation for a truly civilized society. Professor Sterling attempted to interrupt, his trembling hands gripping the lectern. These are just isolated examples, he muttered, his voice faltering. Traore raised his hand, a simple yet commanding gesture that silenced Sterling. Isolated, Professor? Traore asked, his voice now low but sharp as a blade. Let me tell you about true isolation. It's when the Library of Alexandria, founded by an African dynasty, preserved the world's knowledge while the ancestors of Harvard's founders were still living in mud huts. It's when African mathematicians calculated the Earth's circumference while Europeans believed it was flat. It's when our astronomers tracked the stars' movements and understood Sirius B centuries before Western telescopes could detect it. Traore's words were no longer mere facts. They were a torrential flood, sweeping away entrenched prejudices. He wasn't just providing information, he was painting a vivid picture of a radiant Africa, a cradle of knowledge where the light of civilization shone long before the torches of the West were lit. You want contributions to civilization, Professor? Traore asked, his voice rising slightly but still commanding. Then let's talk about medicine, a field critical to human progress. He slowly retrieved another document. In the 14th century, in Mali, the first successful cataract surgery was performed. Doctors not only removed clouded lenses, but used herbal remedies to reduce inflammation and promote healing. Did you know, Professor, that at the time European medicine was still using crude, often deadly surgical methods that frequently led to death or blindness? Traore didn't give Sterling a chance to respond, pressing on with an even more stunning example. Or let's talk about the first successful caesarean section, where both mother and child survived, performed in Uganda in 1879. He looked directly at Sterling. You might be surprised to learn that the techniques used by indigenous African healers included herbal anesthesia, sterilizing the incision with banana wine, and suturing the wound with specialized needles and thread, resulting in high survival rates. These techniques only appeared in Western medicine over 50 years later. Do we dare call that primitive or folk when it surpassed what the West achieved at the time? He turned to another page. And what about vaccination? You might think of Edward Jenner and smallpox, but centuries earlier, smallpox prevention through variolation was widely practiced in West Africa. Africans knew how to inject a small amount of pus from an infected person into the skin of a healthy one to create immunity. This technique was brought to the Americas by enslaved Africans, saving countless lives during epidemics. This wasn't chance, Professor. This was revolutionary medical science. Traore shifted to another field, his gaze challenging. Let's discuss architecture. Did you know that the structure of Great Zimbabwe, a massive stone city in southern Africa, has remarkable acoustic properties, allowing sound to travel miles in open space, a technique modern engineers struggle to replicate? Or the Nubian pyramids in Sudan, not only older than Egypt's but with unique steep slopes, demonstrating a profound understanding of geometry and construction engineering. And then there are the rock-hewn churches of Lalibela in Ethiopia. Traore said, his voice filled with admiration. These churches weren't built, they were carved from monolithic volcanic rock. Entire structures were chiseled deep into the ground, with intricate details down to every column and dome. Modern engineers still struggle to explain how 12th century artisans achieved such precision and scale without advanced tools. But perhaps you've never heard of these works because they don't fit your narrative of a savage Africa. The shift in the audience was palpable. Students, initially skeptical, now sat upright, eyes gleaming. Many scribbled furiously, eager to capture each new piece of knowledge. Some professors, though perhaps still harboring biases, couldn't help but nod at Traoré's compelling evidence. Others, who may have taught these inaccuracies, looked uneasy, as if confronting a mirror reflecting their own shortcomings. Professor Sterling, once the center of attention, now appeared diminished on the podium. His face shifted from initial arrogance to defensiveness, and now panic. Sweat glistened on his forehead despite the cool lecture hall. He grasped for a rebuttal, an excuse, but Traoré gave him no opening. "You also mentioned the Industrial Revolution and Western innovation," Traoré continued, his voice now carrying the absolute authority of truth. "Let's talk about metallurgy. The Haya people in Tanzania produced carbon steel in blast furnaces 2,000 years ago. They developed a sophisticated process to achieve the extreme temperatures needed to smelt and forge steel, creating tools and weapons of superior strength and sharpness. This technique didn't appear in Europe until the Industrial Revolution, nearly 2 millennia later. Is this backward when it was millennia ahead of your time?" He pressed on relentlessly. And the bronze sculptures from Benin, so exquisite and complex that when Europeans first saw them, they refused to believe Africans could have created them. They concocted theories about lost Portuguese artisans to explain a truth they couldn't accept. Africa possessed master craftsmen and advanced metallurgical technology. "Finally, let's discuss agriculture," Traoré said, his voice warm but compelling. "Africa domesticated countless crops vital to the world: pearl millet, African rice, sorghum, yams, black-eyed peas, watermelon, and okra. We developed complex irrigation systems in the Sahel, sustaining cities of hundreds of thousands in harsh climates. And the terraced agriculture of the Dogon sustained their communities for over a millennium in arid conditions where European farming methods would fail in a single season." Traoré paused, locking eyes with the visibly trembling Sterling. "But perhaps none of this qualifies as contribution to you, because it doesn't fit your narrative of a primitive Africa, an Africa needing civilization from the West." The lecture hall was no longer a place for dry academic discourse. It had become a stage for truth, where old prejudices were stripped bare under the light of knowledge. Professor Thaddeus Sterling, once at the pinnacle of prestige, now had vacant eyes and trembling hands clutching the lectern. What he was hearing wasn't just examples, it was a direct assault on the entire ideology he had spent a lifetime building and defending. "But perhaps," Ibrahim Traore continued, his voice lowering slightly, carrying both sadness and weight, "the most important thing, Professor, isn't the inventions or architecture. The most important is a profound philosophical concept that your civilized world is only beginning to grasp: Ubuntu." Traore looked directly at Sterling, his gaze piercing through any evasion. "I mentioned it briefly, but I want to go deeper. Ubuntu, the Bantu philosophy of life, means I am because we are, or a person is a person through others. It's the core of every relationship, every decision in African society. While Western philosophy often focuses on the individual, on personal rights and duties, on independence and sometimes conquest, Ubuntu emphasizes connection, empathy, compassion, and collective responsibility. It's the foundation of a restorative justice system where the goal isn't punishment but healing and community reintegration. It affirms that an individual's value lies not in possessions or solitary achievements, but in how they interact and contribute to the collective prosperity. When you teach about civilization, do you ever mention such a profound ethical system, or do you focus only on the glories of war and conquest, on philosophies justifying exploitation and division? Traoré didn't need an answer. He already knew it. The tragedy, Professor Traoré said, his voice now softer but sharp as a dagger, cutting to the core of prejudice, isn't that Africa contributed nothing to civilization. The tragedy is that scholars like you have spent centuries actively erasing, ignoring, and denigrating those contributions. He paused, letting those words sink into everyone's minds. The entire hall held its breath. Every eye, from students to seasoned professors, was fixed on Ibrahim Traore. They realized this wasn't just an academic debate, it was a moral indictment of a system that had persisted too long. When Timbuktu's library was at its peak, holding more books than any European university, Traore continued, his voice now laced with the pain of forgotten history. The ancestors of Harvard's founders called us illiterate. When our astronomers tracked the stars with astonishing precision, you called us superstitious. When our healers performed complex surgeries, saving countless lives, you called us witches. He shook his head slightly, a gesture of regret, but also indignation. Every step we took, every achievement we made, was ignored, distorted, turned into evidence of our savagery. Why? To justify what? Traoré set his briefcase on the lectern, pulling out one final document. This wasn't an ancient text on mathematics or philosophy. It was something closer, yet carried the weight of centuries of oppression. Professor, he said, his voice resounding through the hall, this is a letter from Cecil Rhodes. The name caused some to flinch. Rhodes, who laid the foundation for Britain's colonial empire in Africa and founded the prestigious scholarship bearing his name, a scholarship Professor Sterling, a Rhodes scholar, likely benefited from. In this letter, he explicitly stated that African history must be suppressed to justify colonialism. A gasp rippled through the audience. This was undeniable proof, a direct confession of a systematic plot to distort history. The raw truth struck the conscience of many. Traoré looked directly at Professor Sterling, his gaze no longer calm but a cold, unrelenting judgment. Your ignorance, Professor, isn't accidental. It's the result of a systematic effort, a deliberate campaign to erase Africa's contributions to human civilization, and you, Professor Thaddeus Sterling, have aided that effort throughout your 47-year career. Traoré's final words landed like a thunderbolt. The silence in the lecture hall was absolute, suffocatingly heavy. Professor Sterling stood motionless at the edge of the stage, his mouth agape, trying to speak but producing no sound. His face was ashen, his body trembling. He was utterly destroyed, not just academically but in personal honor. Traoré wasn't done. I could go on for hours, Professor, he said, his voice now warmer, as if recounting an endless tale of a forgotten treasure. I could tell you about the Dogon's astronomical calculations, who knew of Sirius B centuries before Western telescopes could detect it. I could describe the complex fractal geometry in African art, predating Mandelbrot by centuries. I could explain how the African call and response tradition became the foundation for jazz, blues, rock, and nearly every modern popular music genre. He paused one last time, locking eyes with Sterling, his gaze filled with disappointment, but also power. But I think I've made my point. The question isn't whether Africa contributed to civilization. The question is why you, a professor at one of the world's most prestigious universities, know none of this. Or worse, he said, holding Sterling's gaze, why you knew and chose to deny it. Professor Thaddeus Sterling stood like a statue, his face pale, his eyes vacant, staring into nothingness. His 47-year academic career, his books, lectures, and prestigious awards all crumbled before his eyes, dissolving into dust under the weight of truth. Then, a small sound broke the stillness, a single clap. It came from the third row, where a black female student with shining eyes looked directly at Ibrahim Traore. She clapped slowly, deliberately, as if starting a new rhythm. Moments later, another clap followed, then another, and another. Within seconds, the lecture hall erupted in thunderous applause. Students stood first, followed by professors, and even some hesitant administrators. The applause wasn't just appreciation, it was a wave of mixed emotions, relief after years of prejudice, astonishment at new knowledge, regret for being blinded so long, and a burning hope for the future. Professor Sterling, completely isolated at the stage's edge, looked around desperately. He sought support from trusted colleagues, familiar faces, but no one met his gaze. The resounding applause was a wordless verdict, casting him out of the stream of recognition and respect. Decades of academic power vanished in just 10 minutes. As the applause subsided, though the emotion lingered, a voice rose from the front. It was Professor Lena Ndlavu, head of Harvard's African Studies Department, a tall black woman. Her face radiated pride and emotion. She stood tall, her eyes fixed on Ibrahim Traore. "Mr. President," she said, her voice trembling but resolute, acknowledging Traore's true title for the first time in the lecture, correcting Sterling's disrespect. "As a member of this institution, I deeply apologize." Professor Ndlavu's apology wasn't just personal, it was a reckoning for an entire system. "Your words today have exposed a shameful blind spot in our curriculum, a grave failure in Harvard's mission to disseminate knowledge." She took a deep breath, her gaze unwavering. "I propose that Harvard University immediately review and comprehensively revise our history curricula to fully and fairly include the extraordinary contributions you've presented from the African continent. We have a duty to teach the truth." The applause erupted again, even stronger, a resounding agreement echoing through the hall. This was a moment of awakening, a new commitment to truth. Ibrahim Traore waited for the applause to fade. He scanned the audience, his eyes resting on Professor Ndlavu, a faint smile crossing his lips, one of understanding and appreciation. "I don't seek apologies," he said, his voice warm, returning to its initial calm, but each word carried the weight of wisdom and dignity. "I seek truth, and the truth is that human civilization isn't the exclusive property of any continent or race. Up as the pinnacle of all human achievements, from the first mathematical calculation on a bone in Africa to the greatest scientific discoveries of our era." He looked directly at Sterling, still standing like a pillar of salt, as if petrified by the truth. "But as long as professors like you, Professor Sterling, continue to teach a deliberately incomplete history, we will perpetuate ignorance and prejudice. Today in this room we have a choice, to sustain the lies that have lasted too long, or to courageously embrace the full, rich and complex truth of humanity's achievements." Ibrahim Traore slowly gathered his documents, carefully placing them back in his briefcase. He stepped down from the podium, calm and dignified, as if no earth-shattering event had just occurred. As he passed Professor Sterling, he paused, his eyes meeting the crumbling man's. "Professor," he said softly, but loud enough for the still active microphones to catch, "I've left copies of all these documents and references with your department. I hope you'll find time to read them." It wasn't a threat but an invitation, a final challenge to a mind closed by prejudice. Then, Ibrahim Traore continued walking, returning to his seat. The lecture hall, though the applause had faded, still echoed with his words, and the audience remained captivated by the flood of truths just revealed. Professor Thaddeus Sterling's career was destroyed, but a new door had opened, a conversation begun about a fuller, fairer human history, where Africa stood in its rightful place. The aftermath of that afternoon at Harvard came swiftly and decisively. Within hours, videos of Traore's speech spread like wildfire across social media platforms, with sensational headlines like "African President Destroys Racist Professor at Harvard" or "Legendary Takedown in Academic History." They quickly amassed millions of views. By the next morning, the story appeared on news outlets worldwide. Scholars from African universities promptly provided additional evidence and examples to bolster Traore's arguments. The hashtag Africa Built Civilization began trending globally, sparking an unprecedented dialogue about the continent's history and role. As for Professor Thaddeus Sterling, his reputation, built over nearly 5 decades, collapsed entirely. The next day, he issued a brief statement announcing his early retirement to pursue personal interests. Harvard University, under public pressure and international embarrassment, issued a formal apology. They also announced a comprehensive review of their history curriculum, with a commitment to fully and fairly incorporate Africa's contributions. Sanders Theatre, where the historic confrontation took place, was chosen as the venue for a new annual lecture series focused on Africa's contributions to global civilization. The first speaker, unsurprisingly, was Ibrahim Traore. But perhaps the most meaningful outcome came from the students. Enrollment in African studies programs surged unprecedentedly at top universities in the UK and US. Young historians began journeys to Africa, seeking knowledge in long-neglected archives. Ancient manuscripts in Timbuktu, the Dogon's complex astronomical knowledge, and African healers' traditional medical practices all became subjects of rigorous academic study, opening new doors for knowledge. A year after the Traoré moment, Harvard University unveiled a new statue in its main courtyard. It wasn't of Ibrahim Traoré. He had humbly declined the honor. Instead, it depicted Ahmed Baba al-Timbuktu, a great 16th-century African scholar who wrote 1,600 books on law, medicine, philosophy, and mathematics, educating generations while Harvard was still in its infancy. The inscription on the statue's pedestal carried a powerful and timeless message: knowledge has no color, wisdom has no continent, and truth belongs to all humanity. In an interview years later, Ibrahim Traore reflected on that day at Harvard. "I didn't go there intending to give that speech," he admitted, "but when Professor Sterling made his statement, I thought of all the African children who would hear such words and believe them. I thought of all the brilliant African minds throughout history whose contributions were erased or stolen. I couldn't stay silent. The real tragedy," he continued, "wasn't what an ignorant professor said. It was that his views were accepted in an institution dedicated to truth and knowledge. How many students sat in his lectures over 47 years, absorbing those lies? How many of them rose to positions of power, carrying those prejudices? That's why I had to speak, not to humiliate him, but to break the cycle of ignorance." The interviewer asked if he felt his response was too harsh. Traoré shook his head. "For centuries, Africa's history was written by those who enslaved us, colonized us, and exploited us. They had no interest in recognizing our achievements. When you've been denied your history for so long, speaking the truth isn't harsh. It's necessary. Professor Sterling had 47 years to learn the truth. He chose ignorance. I simply chose not to let that ignorance go unchallenged." Today, the Traoré moment, as it's known, is studied in universities worldwide as a turning point in academic discourse on African history. It serves as a reminder that true knowledge demands humility, curiosity, and a willingness to challenge long-held assumptions. It proves that sometimes the most powerful weapon against prejudice isn't anger or violence, but truth delivered with dignity and backed by undeniable facts. And in classrooms from Lagos to London, from Cairo to Cape Town, teachers now begin lessons on African history with a simple truth that should never have been controversial. Africa isn't just part of human civilization, it's where human civilization began. The silence that enveloped Harvard University that afternoon wasn't just the end of a professor's career. It was the start of a long overdue dialogue about whose stories are told, whose achievements are recognized, and whose contributions to human civilization are remembered. The story of Ibrahim Traoré at Harvard is a profound reminder of the importance of critical thinking and truth in modern life, especially in the United States. The fact that Professor Thaddeus Sterling, an academic monument with 47 years of experience, perpetuated a biased and inaccurate view of African history shows that even the most respected sources can carry serious prejudices or deficiencies. The urgent lesson for real life is to always maintain a critical mindset. Don't hesitate to question. Seek information from diverse sources, especially when that information shapes how we view a group, a culture, or a hidden history. This event is a call to be cautious of one-sided truths and to always dig deeper to uncover the full picture. Traoré's approach to confronting Sterling is an effective strategy worth emulating. When Sterling deliberately demeaned him by addressing him as Mr. instead of President, Traoré didn't respond with anger or aggression. Instead, he chose to counter with intellect and truth, with each specific piece of evidence about the ancient Lebombo bone, the splendor of Timbuktu University, or the depth of Ubuntu philosophy serving as a powerful, undeniable blow. This teaches us that in confrontations, whether in work, studies, or personal relationships, the strength of reasoned arguments and composure is often far more effective than emotional reactions. Instead of letting prejudice or insults provoke a loss of control, use truth and logic to clarify issues and earn respect. Finally, the transformation of the Harvard audience from skepticism to awe and erupting in applause demonstrates humanity's capacity to change perspectives when faced with truth. In a diverse and ever-changing society like the United States, where prejudices about race and culture persist, this story encourages individuals to be open to new perspectives and willing to learn from stories and histories they may not have known. Understanding and respecting the diversity of human civilization, as Harvard later did by honoring Ahmed Baba al-Timbuktu, is the key to building a more just, inclusive, and united society for all. If the story of Ibrahim Traoré's journey moves you, subscribe to the channel to not miss other profound stories about truth and justice. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.